In episode 164 of the Guitar Music Theory podcast, I interview Nashville studio drummer and music producer Scott Williamson. Greetings, guitar engineers. Welcome to the Guitar Music Theory podcast. If you're captivated by the magic of guitar music and eager to unravel the mysteries of music theory, you're in the right place. I'm Desi Cerna, your host, fellow guitar enthusiast, and author of Fretboard Theory, Guitar Theory for Dummies, Guitar Picking Mechanics, and more. Normally, in each episode of this podcast, I delve into the fascinating world of guitar and music theory, demystifying complex concepts and providing practical insights to help you become a more informed and skilled guitarist. But today, instead of exploring chord progressions, scales, and improvisation techniques, I'm going to interview my friend Scott Williamson. Scott has been a top-tier studio drummer in the Nashville area for decades. In addition to his drumming career, Scott is also a mixing engineer and music producer. He'll provide insights into life as a studio musician, answer listener questions, and reveal his favorite guitar parts. You're listening to some of Scott's drumming right now, and we're going to have a great discussion. But before we get started, what should you specifically be working on right now to become a better guitarist? Go to my website, guitarmusictheory.com. Answer the question I ask you about your playing, and I'll send you free custom video instruction that's calibrated to your current level. Whether you're a beginner still needing to learn the basics, or you need help with bar chords, finger picking, guitar soloing, or understanding music theory, I have a free course for you. I can provide you with a plan to put you on track to fill gaps in your playing so you can move forward and reach your music goals. Enroll in your free video course now at guitarmusictheory.com. You can click on the link in the podcast show notes. All right, welcome to the Guitar Music Theory podcast, Scott Williamson.
Hi.
So, Scott, we've known each other for a few years now and gone to church together. I've got to watch you track and work, and I've admired, what you do and everything. And, you are very well known and very well respected here at Nashville. You've been very active and successful for decades. So, I got a handful of things that I want to talk to you about. I want to share with people like what you do kind of on a daily basis, your work as a studio drummer, what that's like, what the studio scene is like, your work as a music engineer and producer. I also asked if you would come up with a handful of guitar songs, since this is a guitar podcast, that you really admire and what are some of your favorites. And we're going to talk about those later. And then I also have some questions that some of my subscribers wanted to ask you, and so we'll get to those as well. But to begin with, let's tell my audience, what does Scott Williamson do?
Okay, well, first of all, this is probably the most nervous I've ever been going into a podcast, because every time I'm around like two guitar players at the same time, it feels like I've gone into an inner sanctum where I don't belong. And you guys just have this language that you speak, and it's always so intelligent and musically astute, and I just feel sort of unqualified to be here. So let's get that out of the way. Like I'm honored to be here, And if I sound stupid, it's because I kind of am. So this will be funny. Okay, so to answer your question.
By the way, that
yes.
reminds me of a joke. I did not make this up. I heard somebody else say this.
All right.
What do you call someone that hangs out with musicians?
Probably a drummer, I would guess.
That's the way I heard it. It's awful, isn't it?
You're a horrible person. Okay, well, the short answer is I am a studio session recording drummer. I assume your audience knows what that is, but for those that might not, it just means I play on people's records and song demos and whatever. I'm also a recording and mix engineer, which is taking, again, people probably know this, but when you're mixing, you're taking all the recorded elements and making them pretty at the end. And I occasionally am a producer. I used to produce more than I do now. Still do occasionally, but mostly drumming and mix engineering now. So
yeah, and you've been what's considered an A-list studio player in Nashville for a couple of decades now.
Well, thank you for saying that. I hope people like what I do. I've actually been here for 35 years. I grew up in Los Angeles and moved to Nashville right out of high school and kind of went straight to work. I thought I would go to college at Belmont like all the musicians do. But, I grew up in the recording studio, so I got here with a little bit of a head start and was able to start working within the first couple of years that I got here. So
yeah. And obviously people quickly recognized that you did have the skill set, to do that line of work. You can have connections and stuff, but if you can't really, produce what people are looking for.
That's true.
Yes. And that's what everyone says about you. Like, if you want to get some really good musicians, for your recording project, check to see if Scott Williamson is available.
Well, I'm glad that they think of me that way.
Yeah. And, I've certainly heard your drumming, and we played together at least a few times, I think.
Yep.
And I thought you were pretty good, Scott.
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm honored. Thank you.
No, I did notice. I'm like, okay, we got a real professional cat here. Everything sounded real good. And so why don't we let's talk about the studio world first as a studio musician. Mm-hmm. So what is that like? You show up to the studio, you have no idea what you're doing. Mm-hmm. It's not like you have any time to prepare or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Time is money. So you're showing up and people are going to talk down an idea. You might get to listen to a very, very rough demo. Could just be a scratch vocal and some piano or something like that. And they're like, okay. They look to you and the other musicians there. They're like, we need to turn this into a full instrumental track and make it sound, ready for radio and perfect, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what you do day in and day out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What I do is in some ways dependent on the assumption that on most days you're not going in and trying to create, a Frank Zappa track or something, because that's not really possible to do in an hour. But pop music just kind of is what it is, for all of us who do this, whatever instrument you happen to play, for drums in particular, there's kind of, there's beats A, B, C, D, E, and F, and that one of them is probably going to be appropriate for any given pop song. So while it is tricky in some cases to show up with no preparation and listen to a demo and read a chart and go, and have a track done in anywhere from 45 minutes to 3 hours, depending on degree of difficulty, it still is fairly predictable because of the nature of pop music. When it gets tricky is if in Nashville you're reading number charts a lot of the time, which most people have probably heard of. But if I'm going into, for instance, a few years ago, and I've talked about this elsewhere, I sight read West Side Story, the Broadway musical, for it was a cast recording of some type, and that was probably the most difficult thing that I've ever done. That's the kind of music that is sort of, it needs to be rehearsed and then sort of absorbed and known before you can really play it. And they gave us 4 days to, 6 hours a day to record the entire thing. And I had never really seen the music before. I had heard some of it, but reading those charts was incredibly challenging, and sort of an odd man out thing for me. But it went okay, but I was sick to my stomach for 4 days. It was that stressful. And it was great for me. But most of the time, it's fairly obvious what needs to be played and how it needs to work out. And if that wasn't the case, what we do would probably fall apart.
Well, I had the opportunity to watch you track once, and I've had the opportunity to watch other sessions with your peers and stuff.
Yeah.
And it just amazes me. I mean, I had a hard time wrapping my mind around what I was seeing, like initially, and just to describe it to my listeners here. So, we've got Scott on drums, and they got, guitar, bass, and keys, and all these other, great studio players. And you all meet in a control room, and you were recording demos, for people that were like aspiring singer-songwriters that wanted to have their songs professionally recorded. And so you would listen to a very rough demo, often just a scratch vocal with an acoustic guitar or something like that.
That's right.
And the producer would talk about, like, stylistically, the direction he wanted to take things in, and you guys would listen to that scratch demo, and you're charting out your Nashville numbers, and
or sometimes somebody's done it ahead of time.
Or yes, okay, yep. The one I saw, you had paper and pencils, and you guys were just listening to that demo, and then at the same time, the producer was kind of giving you cues, like, well, this is what I want it to sound like in the intro, and then verse is going to be down, but then I want you to be big in the chorus, kind of giving you basic direction like that.
Yep.
And then there was some communication between you and the other musicians. You might reference some other pop song or a particular player. Like, you might talk to the bass player and say, oh, maybe this sort of groove or something like that. And he would nod and say, okay. Then you guys all go to your respective instruments, and there's no rehearsing. There's no composing your parts or anything like that. The engineer says, okay, here comes the click. You guys ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. And you just play through this song as if you had already worked out and composed all your parts, and you guys had just gotten off the road, and you had performed that song nightly for, months. And everything it's like alchemy. Everything just came together. It was like voodoo or something. And I'm like, what is going on here? How is this even possible?
Yeah.
And the groove is there, and you're locking in with the bass player, and the guitar player's right there with this perfect rhythm part, and the keyboard player's adding in all these wonderful layers and everything. And you guys play the whole song down, looking at your chart, beginning to end. And then after that, you would punch in here and there, maybe change some parts up, maybe add an extra layer of guitar or percussion or something, and at the end of the hour, like, the instrumental track was done, and it was absolutely amazing.
It's funny, to me, amazing is somebody who can, open up a guy's skull and fix their brain through surgery. That's amazing to me. But I get it when
which you've had done several times.
Oh,
right?
gosh, well, I need it done. I haven't had it done yet, but somebody needs to fix my brain. You said alchemy a minute ago. I'll look that up later. But that was supposed to be funny. It's sometimes the joke bombs. But I joke with people. I bought one of those laser levelers so you can hang pictures on the wall, not crooked, because every time I hung a picture, it was always crooked, and they're still crooked. I can't do anything except play music. That is literally, I did learn to fly 20 years ago because I wanted another skill, but I'm just the most poorly rounded person you'll ever meet. But the one thing that guys like this can do, some of them are better rounded than me. Some of them can actually build a deck on the back of their house. But it is a skill. It's a skill set. And it does seem to wow people who've never seen it before, but it's a job like anything else. The guys that get good at it just know how to do it. They're intuitive. They listen to lots of music to keep their vocabulary wide, and so they know, generally speaking, when they hear a song demo, 80% of the time, the first take that we play is going to be pretty close to what it needs to be. Every once in a while, you'll play down a take, and the producer or the songwriter will say, No, we're never going to get there from here. But that's pretty rare. It's fairly common that because of the years of experience represented in a room like that, guys just kind of know what to do.
Yeah. I mean, it is amazing that, and what I learned about being a studio musician is you have to be skilled on your instrument for sure. You have to know how to get a great tone on your instrument, whether it's drums, guitar, whatever, an appropriate sound. Guitar players have to know how to just get to their pedal board and instantly dial in the right effects.
Yep.
And be ready to go within seconds. So you have to have the skill. You have to be a good player. But that's just the beginning.
Yep.
You have to have the creativity to know how to play those parts that fill out the music perfectly so that it's ready for like a radio release. That's where I struggle, because I can look at, what these studio guys play, and I'm like, I can play all that, but I wouldn't have thought to play it.
That's the thing. That you just touched on a great thing. I think that's kind of what separates the guys who've gotten into the session world. It's hard to know, when people try to place value on players, who's better, who's worse. I think it's different skill sets. I've done just enough live work in my life playing concerts to know that skill is basically stamina and memory. To get up and play for 2 hours without stopping, which, I'm 53 now. That was pretty easy to do in my 20s and 30s. It's getting a little bit more interesting. But it's a moment in time. There's a lot of adrenaline. You want to play a great show, but the mistakes come and go, and you just keep going, and that's the end of it. When you're in the studio, you're under a microscope for whatever amount of time you're working on your part, whether it's 10 minutes or 3 hours. It's for posterity, and it will be heard, especially if it's on some artist project. It might be heard for the next 50 years. So you really want it to be right. But it's not as physically tiring as a live show is. So it's just different skill sets. And the people that do live work really, I just went the other night and saw Jacob Collier's show. I don't know how familiar you are with Jacob Collier. Yeah. Watching that show, it's the kind of thing where you come away from it going, well, I'm either going to have to go back into the practice room for the next 6 months and just woodshed, or I guess I'm getting out of the business, because it's just so good. It's on such another level. And they're doing it live. That was what was remarkable. I've heard his recordings and been completely blown away by it. To hear them pull that off live is even more fascinating. So it's just funny how these skill sets sort of work out in the different contexts, and you learn something from all of them.
Yeah, and I know people who are touring musicians, and they're excellent at it.
Phenomenal.
And sometimes people can do both. They can do the touring thing, like Scott Bernard, and they can do the studio thing. But I know other people that are like, man, like, the studio thing is just not my strength, but they're excellent in live situations. They're great performers, and they're, and it's a different skill set. You're right.
It's funny. I just realized I didn't complete my thought a minute ago. You got me onto something. Steve Gadd is a great example, one of the great drummers of all time. Everybody knows it. There are lots of people who, if they practice hard enough, they can play what Steve played. But who thought of 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover?
Right, yeah.
Who, that's it. What separates people like Steve Gadd is he thought of something that literally changed the entire trajectory of the instrument. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really when people become exceedingly special.
Yeah, and that's a skill that's really needed in the in the studio environment. You need someone that can be creative and come up with those perfect parts. I have done very little studio work in my days. That's just not my strength. And when I have, they provided me some demos or some charts ahead of time, and I said, give me a week and I'll listen to this track and let's see what I come up with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in some cases, it worked out well and they were very happy. However, you can't be a studio musician and do that. Time is money. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've watched people like you bang out 10 songs in a day. Mm-hmm. Coming in cold, having no idea what you're going to get thrown at you, that day. And it's just remarkable to see how quickly you can think on your feet and work and come up with those parts that would take me a week to complete one song, and I'd have to really work on it each day and put a lot of thought into it.
I will say though that session players are like everybody else. We enjoy the adrenaline rush of having to work quickly and spit something out that's really good. But we also love it when we have time to really make art. Yeah. Some guys will work on their own stuff on their own time just to kind of to get that out, to kind of express themselves in a way that where they're afforded the time to really be artistic. But yeah, you do take some pleasure in being able to produce something really good, really quickly. It's just it's a different kind of satisfaction, I guess.
Well, and we all hear stories about how the Eagles took all
sure.
incredible length of time to complete an album or something, and just how they, or how an artist took a lot of time on one song. And so there's different types of studio sessions, where artists can really, they're in there, they're doing their writing, they're working out ideas, they're experimenting with sounds and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But that's typically not what you're facing. Like, people are booking studio time, they're hiring professional studio musicians like you because they want to knock out a lot of material in a day. They want to knock it out quickly. It's about, and so it just requires someone that has that skill set to operate.
We used to, I remember years back in the 90s when record budgets were, we'll just say, different from what they are now. We would book a studio for 5 days, a full week, to record tracks for an artist and do at most 2 songs a day, and just be creative. And that was really fun too. And so it's there's merit to both approaches here, because there is absolutely truth also. Even when you're making what you would consider to be really high art, sometimes once you kind of know the song, that first or second take, there can be some magic there that you'll never get back if you start thinking too hard.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work out that way, but it can happen. Like, sometimes even when you want to take your time, sometimes the best stuff happens early. So it's an interesting, it's fascinating, having done this all these years, seeing how quickly you can start to unravel if people start thinking too hard.
Yeah. So let's talk about, what type of skills do musicians need to have if they wanted to be successful and as a studio musician. You are actually known as being a very good sight reader. That's not true for all studio musicians. Some will fully admit that that's kind of their Achilles heel. It doesn't always, it's not always necessary here in Nashville because of the Nashville number system and number charts and stuff. And if a musician can read a number chart or sketch out a song form in some way, and then play creative parts, his ability to read standard musical notation typically in most situations is not as important. However, I understand that when it is important, there are certain people that that you're going to call.
Right. Yeah. So in fairness, the Nashville number system is still sight reading, but it's more, most of the time you can get the entire song on one page of music. It's great because if it's well written, sort of in blocks, you can literally look at the page and you kind of know the song. because, chord changes being what they are, they're fairly standardized in pop music. So you just kind of look at the page and you get kind of an idea of where you're headed. It's a really, really intuitive system for pop music. But I would still, even though it is theoretically easier from an intellectual standpoint to do that than to read staff, it's still a version of sight reading. So anytime, as you said earlier, anytime you go into a session, 90% of the time we have not heard anything until we get there and hear the demo and look at that number chart. But yes, the staff reading, which is all I knew how to do growing up. I'm sorry, I keep touching this thing.
That's what she said.
Growing up in Los Angeles, I didn't. Oh my gosh, Michael Scott emerges. Growing up in Los Angeles, I didn't know anything about the number chart until I got here. And so you said that I'm known as being a good sight reader. I guess that's true, but when I see the guys that do it all the time, I would only barely place myself at a B minus as a sight reader. There's guys that can, for instance, I mentioned the West Side Story thing. That's the kind of thing that the guys who do it all the time, who just read that chicken scratch kind of, they probably wouldn't have had a real hard time reading that stuff. And for me, it was like, reading Tolstoy. But it's still, I'm glad that I know how to do it, but I don't. My host.
Well, as you mess with your glasses there, it's rubbing on the microphone there. Just be careful.
Okay.
We're going to transition next to your supreme engineering skills and how you handle microphones. That's what we'll.
I've never worn a headset. I don't know the rules with headsets. But yeah, it's sight reading is another skill, and it has become more and more necessary as new clientele has come into Nashville. There's a lot of different types of music being made here now that didn't used to happen. It used to be almost entirely country music and contemporary Christian music, and now, as mentioned, there's Broadway cast recordings being made here and all kinds of film scoring, video film, really, really big kinds of stuff where that reading is more necessary.
Yeah, in some of the sessions that I saw, there was actual notation. Those were called rhythm charts.
Yeah.
This is where you've got everything written out measure by measure.
Yeah.
And in those rhythm charts, most of the time you're just comping your own parts. That there's some basic information there on the chord and everything. It doesn't have everything notated that you're supposed to play. You're supposed
Master
to look at that.
rhythm charts. Yes.
Yeah, and you figure out what your instrument is going to do, and you comp your own parts there. But then might be occasions where something is notated. Maybe there's like a unison figure that the whole band follows and stuff like that. And so the musicians have to be able to comp their own parts, but then quickly read a part down when there's something specific that needs to be played. And so, and the good guys can do that on the spot in a first take. I watched bassist Gary Lunn track one day, and I think he got almost everything in one take and set his bass in a stand and picked up a book and was reading a book while everyone else kind of
a lot of times you'll get 80% of it on the first take and just say, hey, I need to grab the second verse again. I didn't like, maybe the drummer and the bass player didn't line up their parts together, whatever it happens to be. But the master rhythm chart that you mentioned is sort of the letter staff chart equivalent of a Nashville number chart. Just enough information to get everybody on the same page, no pun intended. But still, you're kind of leaving everybody open to being able to add their own ideas without having... I notice when I'm reading very, very specific drum notation, when I listen back to what I played, I can hear myself doing the math. The guys that do it all the time can make it sound like music. And I feel like I'm sort of there, but it's just harder. You're thinking so much harder when you read that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, so sight reading is a necessary skill for any studio musician. At the very least, the Nashville number system.
That's right, yeah.
You need to be familiar with like the basics of notation, because you need to be able to scratch out like a basic rhythm or something. Oh, that this is going to be driving eighth notes, or there's a break, or there's an accent here. I've seen you do that where you're quickly writing out some sort of syncopated figure or something. So even though you may not be reading full standard musical notation, being familiar with the basics of it is going to be necessary to be, a studio player.
Yep.
You don't necessarily need to be able to read music like a concert violinist. However, for some projects that might be necessary. Mm-hmm. But that's probably a situation where there's certain type of people that specialize in that. I don't know if just because I know people that work that will tell you that like that's not my thing. I can do I can do 80% of sessions that I'm called for, but if I have to read like a concert violinist, I'm out.
Yeah, I don't know how many brilliant session level players there are in this town. There are a lot, but there's obviously the orchestra players in town can all read, but in terms of the rhythm section guys, it's probably a fairly small percentage of them that read those that kind of heavyweight chart.
And the flip side of that is if you put a Nashville number chart in front of a orchestra player, you're not likely going to get much.
Yeah. Now, if oddly enough in Nashville there are some guys that really understand them, but no, that wouldn't be common, and in general they would not want to see that.
Yeah.
So.
Right, because their thing is they're going to read standard notation. Everything's going to be written out for them. They're not typically not expected to comp. Things are orchestrated and notated.
No, not if they're in a section. Occasionally, obviously, like you've got a fiddle player on a country session. They're not reading. They're making it up as they go.
Yeah.
Which is another brilliant thing to watch. Is just watching the interplay between a guitarist, a fiddle player, a steel guitarist, and a piano player on a country session, how that comes together pretty instantaneously. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Totally different type of musicianship. But yeah, if you've got, 20 or 40 string players in a room with that many people on the floor getting paid, the parts have to be written out ahead of time or you're going to have serious trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have to have some amount of reading skills.
Yeah.
You have to be very creative, because although there may be some input about what they'd like, from your part, they're expecting that you are going to come up with those parts, that what the rhythm guitar should be or what the layers of rhythm guitar should be. Because typically what happens is after things are tracked, the guitar players have to add a couple layers of guitars and stuff like that. So they're really relying on you to comp your own parts, creative parts, dial in your own tones. They might give some direction, like I want a lot of power in this bridge section, so turn up the overdrive. But so you have to be creative, and I think this we can transition to something you said earlier. You need to be familiar with a lot of popular music. This is something that I am constantly emphasizing, to my guitar students, because they're like, well, I wish I was, better at, finger picking, or I wish I was better at, guitar soloing or being more creative. How do I come up with better ideas? And I say, well, how many finger picking songs have you learned? Well, I haven't really learned any. Or how many guitar solos have you learned? Well, I haven't really learned any. I'm like, all right, before you try to be creative with something that you don't really have any experience doing, you need to build a repertoire of songs. Learn some of the classic guitar solos. Learn some songs. Familiarize yourself with them. Kind of know them inside and out and how they work. It's like then when you go to improvise or compose, like you understand how it works now, and you've got kind of a vocabulary to work with. So that's super important, and that's something that I've noticed from you and other studio musicians. Like when we're just hanging out and we start talking about music, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a classic rock song, John Bonham on a Led Zeppelin song, or you're talking about whatever, the latest, Billie Eilish, what's her name?
Billie Eilish.
Song. Like everyone's like, oh yeah, like, that you get everyone's familiar with it, and they're going to talk about the groove or how they love the way that the drums, connect with the bass or something. Like these studio musicians are lovers of music, and you have just consumed so much music. You've listened to it, you've learned it, you've played it, and this is one of the reasons why you have such a tremendous vocabulary and repertoire.
Yeah, there's anytime I'm clinicking or even just having breakfast with a young up-and-comer that wants to do what we do, that is one of the big answers to every question is, well, you've just got to have a vocabulary. And for instance, I grew up, in addition to being a studio musician and a sometimes producer, he was an orchestrator. My dad did all of that stuff, but he was also a music minister. So I grew up in the studio, as mentioned, and at church. That was pretty much my upbringing. And my parents wisely, when I was much younger, were careful that I wasn't exposed to too much. There's a lot of stuff lyrically, particular in certain types of music that they didn't want me exposed to when I was 5, 6 years old. So I grew up listening to a lot of contemporary Christian music and a lot of this is a funny leap here, but that, and then a lot of very old school deep jazz like Coltrane, Miles, a lot of big band stuff, Basie, Ellington, these kind of things, there's a huge gap between those things and contemporary Christian music. And then I heard whatever was on pop radio, especially if I was at friend's house or driving in the car somewhere. But my dad in particular, as I got to be a teenager and early adult life, he's like, look, if you're going to be a session musician, you're not going to get everything you need from, listening to Stephen Curtis Chapman. That's just not going to, that's fine, but you're going to have a bigger vocabulary than that. And I also remember being on one of my early sessions, and there was the producer gave a reference. He said, yeah, I want this to be kind of a Mike and the Mechanics thing. Well, I had heard Living Years 100 times if I'd heard it once on the radio, but I never paid attention to what it was. And I was probably 17 by this time. And he said, he made the Mike and the Mechanics reference, and I kind of looked at him funny. I without knowing it, I knew what he was talking about. I just didn't know the reference. And he said to me, let me get this straight. You want to be a session player and you're not familiar with these artists? Well, that was a wake-up call. Mm-hmm. And I realized in that moment I'm going to have to listen to everything. If I want to, the mark of a great session player is being proficient and believable at least 80% of what's thrown at you, and in a perfect world, anything that's thrown at you. So that was sort of the turning point for me. You've got to listen to all kinds of music, preferably great music, which I know is a bit subjective, but you need to be conversant with all styles, everything. I've made this joke before. If somebody wants to do speed metal, I tell them, I'm not your guy. I've got 3 or 4 guys in town who are amazing at it. Here's their number. But for the most part, if I get called, I want to be able to deliver. And you only get there through just listening to lots of music and absorbing it. Yeah. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's a great answer. I think that's what people need to hear. There aren't any shortcuts,
right,
to being a studio musician. And the same is true with just being a musician, in general. A lot of times what people are frustrated with their playing because they just don't feel like it's developed much, or that, they just don't have the skill set. And, it's like you have to work on a repertoire. Mm-hmm. Particularly people who are, would reach out to me because they're dissatisfied with their creativity, Mm-hmm. They want to be a songwriter, but it's they learn G, C, and D, and they're like, but I'm just finding like I'm struggling, for ideas. And I'm like, well, you need to expose yourself to more music and learn more things and analyze, these songs analyze songs and, learn a little bit of, practical music theory. And so, no, I appreciate your answer. And then I think that you also have to love it too. Some people want to be something, but they don't really love the process of getting there. So,
Yeah. Well, and that brings up an interesting point. When I'm up, so you have to love it. You have to love the process of getting there, to use your term. But when I get into the studio, a session player's job is to do a really, really good piece of work, a believable piece of work, even when it's a style or a piece of music that you're not crazy about. It's not my job to love everything I do. It's my job to make it sound like I love everything that I do. And I'm very, very fortunate. I mean, even on my worst day, this is a great job. It's because you're with people you like most of the time. There's a lot of funny jokes going around. People are witty. They're gifted. It's a really neat atmosphere to be in. But there are times where you're going to show up and it is a job, and you're not going to love every waking moment of the entire recording session. And you've got to be okay with that, and to remember that you're going to walk home with a paycheck from somebody who trusted you with their, this diamond ring that they're calling a song. And it might be the best song you've ever played on, or it might not, it might not be. But you're being paid to be there, and you've got to give it 100% even when you're not feeling it.
Oh, hey, y'all, this is an overdub. Somehow, in the process of mixing this podcast audio down, I deleted some audio, and I cannot find it. What's happening here is that Scott and I had transitioned into talking about his work as a recording engineer, and we will just pick up with what I got.
All of those elements at the end stage, and figuring out how to put them all together in a way that's going to be pleasing to the listener.
And that requires some really good listening, really good ears. That's EQing, that's understanding what frequencies really highlight an instrument and help it fit into a mix, and how you have to cut frequencies in order to have it not interfere with something else, and pan stuff left to right, and then compress stuff so that it's not too spiky or anything like that. Anything else you want to add about what it involves?
I mean, it's basically just trying to figure out what was the intent of the artist and the producer. What were they going for here, and then highlight it. And there's, for every song I get, you could probably hand it to 10 different mix engineers, all of whom would do something uniquely great with it, and totally different, and every approach might work brilliantly. So it's there's a little bit of subjectivity in it, but if you get something that's well put together, you can kind of turn on the faders with just kind of turn it on in its raw form and kind of know what it is and go to work from there. But I'm just always, most of my time in a mix is, like I said, trying to figure out what did the producer, the arranger, the singer, what were they aiming for here? I'm trying to get a sense of that, and then honor them by trying to feature the things that I think they would want featured. And I'm the kind of guy, if I get an email back, first of all, I won't let the mix out of my mix room until I'm satisfied enough with it that if no one asks for any changes, I'm happy to hear this on the radio. This feels like good work. That almost never happens. Usually there's at least a few things that somebody wants tweaked. But if I get an email that's, 2 pages single-spaced of mix notes, I usually respond with, you know what, I'm probably the wrong guy. We shouldn't, if it's going to be this hard, then you need to just don't pay me, find somebody else. That doesn't happen very often, but it seems to me that, if there's that much that needs to be fixed, then I blew it, or they just simply had a different vision for what it needs to be. So, yeah.
Now, so that's mix work, that's engineering. Now, what about being a producer? How is that role different?
Well, the way that I try to explain that to people, a producer for music is essentially like a director for a movie. Different producers have different approaches, but at the end of the day, your job is to oversee and nurse a project from inception to completion. So when I'm doing it, I like to help pick the songs. I like to help the artists go through their cache of songs that they're looking at for the project and help them pick the best ones. I'm not always right about that, but I think it's helpful to speak into that. And then you just, from that point, you're going through the how do we approach it process, who do we call, who are the players, who's the programmer, who are the engineers, what all needs to happen in order for this to be, presented in its best light. Mm-hmm. And you take it all the way through the mixing and mastering process with the artist. Most artists are very involved in the process. They have very, very specific opinions about how, because it's their baby, and all I'm doing is trying to help them steward what they have. And in some cases, it can be a little bit adversarial because, usually in most cases, the producer lives in the recording studio while the artist lives out on the road performing this material and comes into the studio periodically. So sometimes the producer is trying to help steer the artist away from bad decisions. But again, there's some subjectivity here also. So especially when you're working with an artist and you fall in love with one of their songs almost as much as they're in love with it, that's when it can really become adversarial, because you start to have very strong opinions about I'm trying to be your audience. How would I want to hear you do this song? And if you disagree with the artist about that, at the end of the day, they probably should win because it's their song. But occasionally there's a situation where you want to go, I'm just telling you, my job here is to be your audience, and I think this is going to be better. And that tug of war can get interesting. And you just have to decide in those situations after the discussion and the hard conversations who's going to win here. And I've had to go both ways. And again, my position in general is that the artist should usually win because they're the ones that have to live with this for the rest of their life. But occasionally helping somebody win means that you do it the way the producer thinks instead of the artist. I think that's rare. I think the artist usually knows. It's just tricky. It's a tricky dance, and I've been in situations that were very adversarial and other situations that were incredibly peaceful the whole time. And what's funny is sometimes that really adversarial stuff is the stuff where you produce the best art, because everybody cares so much about what the end game looks like. And so while it may be tough while you're in the studio, what you end up with at the end can be fantastic.
Yeah.
It's like watching a VH1 behind the music special. Those fist fights behind the scenes sometimes lead to amazing art. So,
are those VH1? Is VH1 still a thing?
That's going back. I just showed my age. But we used to watch those constantly when we were younger, and it was always the same story. There was always some big fight. Sorry, I know I'm making noise on the mic. But yeah, crazy the way that stuff goes down.
I was trying to explain to my daughters recently what MTV was. It
still exists, but it's not the way it used to.
They used to just play videos.
Yeah, I know.
It was great. So you diversified, and you do some engineering, you do some producing, and then you've also done some touring and stuff. You toured with some major artists. I think that they were mainly contemporary Christian artists. Is that who you toured with?
Yeah, when people think of touring, they think of being on a bus for 6 months at a time. I've never done anything like that, but I did do some stuff with some artists where leave on Thursday, get back Sunday, sometimes get on a plane, fly overseas, for a few weeks. Mm-hmm. But I'm essentially a homebody. I want to be with my wife and kids, and so being gone for more than a few days at a time has always been tricky for me.
Actually, this brings up an interesting point that I've noticed that there are some people that really kind of specialize in the touring thing. That's their main thing. So they'll go out, on the tour bus for months at a time. And people who really specialize with the studio thing, touring is not good for them. Maybe they're not cut out for that lifestyle. Maybe they're a fantastic player, but they're not really, maybe they don't have the look, or they're not a really great performer on stage or something like that. But I have heard that, if your bread and butter is studio work, but you're gone for months at a time and your seat is empty, someone else comes along to fill that. So if that's your priority, that you want to stay, you want to continue to do that work, it's not wise for you to take another offer that takes you away from it for a while.
Yeah, that's always been a concern. There are some guys that have been able to kind of buck that. I've got some friends who are so in demand, so well regarded, so good at what they do in the studio, that even if they leave for a couple of months at a time, when they come back, they're immediately busy again. And that requires a little bit of good marketing skills. You just tell people, look, look, no one's going to leave their session chair unless it's a pretty big opportunity to go out and play live. It's got to be an artist that the pay's got to be good, or it's got to be enough exposure with this artist that it's going to pay really big dividends later. So you've got to be choosy because there is some truth to what you said. If you really, really are committed to being a session player, then you can't be gone regularly for 4 weeks or months at a time. But again, if you've been here for 15 or 20 years and you've developed a reputation for being one of the best, and you decide that you want to, go out and do a tour that's going to be really, really well marketed and received, you can probably get away with it and still come back to work.
Yeah.
But you've got to be, that's only going to work for people that are really, really good at what they do and well known. So
this might be a good idea to tell one of my favorite musician jokes.
Oh boy, am I going to be the brunt of it?
You want to? Well, you're familiar with it. What are the 4 stages of a musician?
Yeah, that's yes. Go ahead.
Here we go. What are the 4 stages of a musician? Number 1, who is Scott Williamson? Number 2, get me Scott Williamson. Number 3, get me a young Scott Williamson. Number 4, who's Scott Williamson?
Yes. And I just heard recently that they've added a 5th.
Oh.
There's one put in between. Who's Scott Williamson? Get me Scott Williamson. What was the order?
Get me a young Scott Williamson.
Get me a young Scott Williamson. Then, has anyone seen Scott Williamson? And then, who's Scott Williamson? Yeah. That's the... And when it's really true, I mean, that's basically the trajectory of almost everybody's career. What are you going to do?
That's great. All right. Coming up here, we're going to answer some listener questions.
Okay.
That sound good?
Sure.
All right. All right, so we're moving on to some listener questions. I received some by email and some were posted on Facebook and stuff. So we'll just kind of go through these. This first one comes from Ken. It's a 2-parter.
Hi, Ken.
And he says, I have always heard that studio musicians were expected to perform quickly. In today's musical environment, do you get to run through the songs a few times before final recording? That's question 1. And question 2 is, how much feedback do you get from the producer and artist on what you play?
Okay, number 1 is yes, sometimes. As mentioned earlier, sometimes the early take, though, has some magic to it that you don't want to let go of. But depending on how much time there, for instance, sessions are generally booked in 3-hour blocks. If they're trying to get 5 songs in a session, then the answer is no, there's no time. We got to get a song every 40 minutes. With really no breaks, but if I'm only trying to get 3 songs a day and we've got 2 or 3 sessions booked, then there's plenty of time to be fully creative and try out different things. The second question, it depends on the producer. or the songwriter, whoever's driving the ship. Some people are very opinionated. I have one producer I've worked with over the years where we will sometimes work on each section of the song for 20 or 30 minutes before we ever run a take of the entire song. So, you're talking about, to get one track with this producer is minimum a 3-hour process to get one song, and usually more than that. And sometimes it's a full day process, and then he's still working out different things for another week after the fact, just because he's so immersed in the process of making it. So, and then there's other producers who are pretty happy with almost everything that you do, and will just give you kind of suggestions on a per section basis, and sometimes they're just like, yeah, that's great, let's move on. So the guys that do this we've worked with all different kinds of producers, the kind who very micromanage every part of the process, and others who are pretty hands off, and everything in between.
So it kind of depends on the project too. Like, there are some projects though where you're like, okay guys, we're going to get 10 songs done this day. Yeah. And we're not going to put a lot of time into this.
And everybody just understands on days like that it's the first idea is going to have to be the one.
Yeah. I remember watching a session that was being tracked like that, where they were going to knock out a whole project in a day. And the drummer was Dan Needham.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the best in town.
Yeah. And he's like, hey, give me that transition like into that bridge. Let me redo that fill really quick.
Yep.
And he was taking less than a minute to work out some ideas there. And I was sitting in the control room, and like the engineer was getting impatient. He's like, he's overthinking it. And I'm like he just didn't want to even let you guys have a minute. He's like, come on, let's go. We got all these songs to get through.
That's the opposite end of the spectrum. You've got the micromanagement thing, and then you've got occasionally when everybody feels rushed, there can sometimes be somebody in the room that's like, we don't need to spend any time on any of this.
Yeah.
And everybody, even in a rush situation, there's not anybody in there that is okay to walk away from a part knowing people are going to hear it later. If you feel like you screwed something up, we really do need to fix this. Yeah. And I've known Dan for years. He's not the type of guy to slow a session down. If he thought something needed to be resolved, then it needed to be resolved.
Yeah, I remember just being surprised because I was like, golly, like they don't even want to give people just like a few seconds to work on something. But they were up against the clock.
They are. That's the dilemma. That's the dilemma. So, great question.
Well, and I guess it might depend on the project. If it was something that was going to be released for the radio, okay, then you're going to have to a lot more time for it.
Yep.
But there's certain collections of music that's done for like publishers or stuff. But this was a collection of songs that were going to be demos for sheet music that was being released.
Yeah, it might have been choral print music for choir
That's exactly
churches,
what it was. So they're like, look, this is just a demo. We don't need to fuss too much over these.
Yeah, but we all have a work ethic, and nobody wants to have something out there, a recording of themselves where they know, they made a mistake or they could have done something better.
Scott, that's every recording I've ever done of myself.
Oh, self-deprecation.
All right, we're moving on. Charles says, what is the best way to hire a studio musician in Nashville or elsewhere for a project? What's the cost these days? Hopefully not what it was in the 80s, but of course bands aren't necessarily making tons of money either. I asked him if he would be a little bit more specific, and he says that he's guessing a good studio musician would be charging about $200 an hour by now, but I would like to see how easy it would be to book that musician remotely or otherwise, and how much is the going wage. Any information from the point of view of someone who is wanting to hire the gunslingers would be interesting or helpful.
Okay. Hi, Charles. Thanks for the question. Well, the way, you can, if you're specifically looking for Nashville musicians, you can call the union. Most of us are in the book if you're looking for an email address or a phone number. As far as the money is concerned, that's a funny timing on your question. There are union rules that are followed. And then, there are a lot of, especially with the remote stuff, it's been interesting trying to figure out how to make that work within the musicians union ecosystem. The union pay wage is what it is, but in terms of hourly rates, when you're doing a group session with a bunch of guys in the room, I'm not aware of anybody making $200 an hour, but it's a decent living. I guess double scale would get up there, but there's less of that happening than there was 20 years ago. It's an interest. The reason I said the timing is funny is because we're in sort of a weird. We're in a weird time in the industry where inflation is rising. Every industry, if I call my plumber or go to the grocery store, the price of everything has gone up. But musicians are having a tough time raising their rates right now because, as Charles mentioned, the industry has shifted. People are having to get more creative about how to make a living in the music industry. Selling merch, records don't make the kind of money that they used to. So some would make the argument that guys like me should just be happy that there's recording still going on, and that whatever money I'm making, I should just be thankful for. And I do see that side of the argument. I mean, it's a great job and it is a good living, but our rates really have not changed significantly in 25 years. And find me another industry where that is the case. So your question is fraught with baggage. It's a loaded question, and I'm not sure how else to answer it other than you'll just have to talk to whoever you would like to work with and get a rate quote from them.
Yeah. Yeah, and Charles, I don't know what you're looking to hire specifically, but I do know some people, particularly guitar players and stuff, that do remote work and everything. So I'll get you connected if you want to reach out and give me some more information. Let's move on to our next caller. This is Gary. He says he's a long-time listener, first-time caller.
Hi, Gary.
He doesn't say that, but I felt obligated to say that. And he says, do drummers tune drums to a major scale?
I think so. I've never cared about that. I'm looking for the sweet spot on a. First of all, I am less of a gear nerd than some people are. I have always sort of had the look. If this kit sounds good, I'll play it. I don't. I happen to play WFL3 drums and adore them. They're kind of. I would sort of say they're like late '60s Ludwigs with new wood. And there's a new guy out of Los Angeles, K-Watt Drum Co. K-Watt Drum Company, who is making amazing snare drums. So those are two brands that I'm really thrilled with and having a lot of fun playing the stuff. But again, I have always just loved drums. I played on a CB700 kit once that I thought it was somebody was pranking me, and then I sat down to play it, and it sounded fantastic. They'd worked on the bearing edges, and it sounded pretty good. I don't really care that much about the gear. Okay, edit this part out. Give me the question again. I was using that to bridge to.
Do you tune to the major scale?
Okay, edit that out. So the gear doesn't the gear doesn't matter that much to me. And what I'm, as long as it sounds good, when I'm tuning drums, I'm looking for the sweet spot on each specific drum. There are some drums that are really, toms in particular, that you can kind of tune them however you want to. They'll sound kind of good in different places. And other drums where they've got kind of a range, and I'm just looking for whatever sounds good. I've lately been really into 13 and 16 toms, and just kind of finding wherever they sit well. I really like snares that have a wide range, a high or low. I tend to play lower pitch snares now, and I just tune stuff until it sounds good to me. I don't have any particular methodology other than the old trick of cranking when you first put a head on it, cranking the head up to almost the breaking point, and then putting my full body weight on it and sort of bouncing with the ball of my foot, just to break the head in. which it always scares them to watch it, but it actually is helpful for a drum head sometimes.
And maybe what Charles was getting at is that drummers don't tune to the pitch or the key of the music like other instruments do.
No.
It's percussive.
Yeah.
You're just making noise.
It's not even music, really. Let's face it. No, I just want the drums to sound good in their natural habitat.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. Yeah. This comes from, his name is Loy, Loy.
Hi, Loy.
Favorite artist that you got to work with, and what DAW, digital audio workstation, do you use?
I'm a Pro Tools guy. It's mostly just that's what I learned when I first got into DAWs 20-some years ago. Pro Tools was the one that I learned. That's probably because I was and am an engineer, and it seems like even for artists that work in Logic or some other system, a lot of times when it comes around to the final mix process, it ends up in Pro Tools. But my son he composes for online documentaries and gaming and stuff, and he's all Logic. I'm not one of those guys that says one's better than the other. That's the one I learned.
Yeah.
And what was the other part of the question? Oh, favorite
artist.
Well,
besides me in this podcast.
Yeah, no, this podcast is probably my favorite thing I've ever done up to today. But, that's a really hard question. The first part of my career, there was a lot of contemporary Christian music that I worked on. And that was a really good era for that genre because there was a lot of different types of stuff being done. I worked years ago with, people might be aware of Toby Mac. He was in a band called DC Talk. He started the band. And they were huge in the 90s, and I got to work on a couple of records for them that I'm very, very proud of. To this day, that's high up at the top of my list of stuff that I'm really grateful to have gotten to do. I worked, it's been 10 or 15 years ago now. Alice Cooper, believe it or not, did a sequel to his early 70s project, Welcome to My Nightmare. He did Welcome to My Nightmare 2. And Bob Ezrin was the producer, and if you don't know who that is, he did Pink Floyd's The Wall and a few other, Kiss maybe a little bit.
Yeah, he did Kiss Destroyer.
Yeah, so getting to be in the studio with Bob Ezrin and Alice Cooper was just a trip. And to go from, playing on contemporary Christian stuff to working on an Alice Cooper record was just absolutely, whiplash. And so much fun. And Alice, both of them were just delightful. Alice could not have been sweeter. And that was really fun. And what was comical about it was I spent 4 or 5 days in the studio with them. And then the next day I was playing on Southern gospel music, which was, you want to talk about the plight of the session musician and just needing to be, really, really versatile. That was a fascinating. You talk about whiplash. So, I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. There've been lots of things.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Martin asks, "What's your favorite album that you've worked on?" So maybe people would look up Alice Cooper. What was it called again?
Welcome to My Nightmare 2.
And that features the drumming of Scott Williamson.
Yeah, and Jimmy Sloas on bass. And it's so unexpected and just not anywhere on the spectrum of my career trajectory. That was a real surprise getting to work on that. Yeah. I got to do a thing with Bob James and Nathan East 7 or 8 years ago called Turbulence. It was just one song. Maybe it was a couple of songs, but that was really, really neat to get to do that.
You say Nathan East?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It was just, what an honor to work with those guys. The DC Talk thing, there were several CCM records back in the 90s that I was really excited to be part of. So early 2000s, yeah.
Brian says, how would an aspiring young guitarist get to be a studio musician? Well, these days you could do it remote if you can put your material out there on a website or social media, post to Instagram, and if people are out there networking with musicians, they might say, hey, can you track some stuff for me? But perhaps he's talking about how would you move to a town like Nashville and how do you get involved in that industry?
Yeah. It used to be the standard answer was get to Nashville, audition for some tours, get out, go on tour, get your name known that way, and then come back and try to get into the session scene. And I think there's still validity to that, but you do, if you're going to be on sessions, you've got to people have to find out that you can play, and I will invite young drummers to sessions. That's how I learned in Los Angeles. I would go and watch guys on sessions in LA, and so I try to get guys that are aspiring to do it. If my sense is that they've got what it takes, I like to bring them in and let them watch and introduce them to people, and just get them in the session atmosphere. Your face has got to be seen, and then when you get that first call, don't screw up, because word gets around fast, good or bad.
Yeah.
It's cutthroat.
I moved to Nashville 10 years ago, and it was kind of a unique circumstance. I moved here because I could, but I didn't need any work. I was already established, with my website and my online instruction and everything. I was working from home, and so I didn't go down to Broadway, didn't want a gig, wasn't looking for anything. I just, was picking up and moving for other reasons. But being here, meeting people, you meet neighbors who are musicians. I met musicians in church and everything. Mm-hmm. Like over the years, like eventually someone said, "Hey, would you record something for me?" Or "I'd like to have you be a guy for some of my video demos," and or "Can we play this gig?" And so, you have to kind of be in a certain location, and you have to make connections, and people have to get to know you. And it's interesting how, I wasn't even looking for that work, but when you're here in the middle of it, if you have the skills, people say, "Oh, you play guitar, really?"
There are guys doing it remotely in other parts of the country, and some of them are charging a lot of money and doing fine.
Yeah.
So social media and the internet has created new opportunities for people. But if your aim is to get into the session scene, doing sessions with people, you kind of have to be in a town where that's happening, and then you've got to let people know what you do and get seen.
Yeah, and the same would be true if someone wants to be like a touring musician or that sort of thing. It's like I have had some opportunities come my way for that sort of thing, just because I'm here, and I met people that were doing that or connected to that, and they're like, "Oh, will you cover this gig for me?" And I don't know that I would have had those same opportunities had I not been, here and happened to make friends with a neighbor who, is a professional musician, And this last question comes from Gene Mark. This is a doozy. We could do a whole podcast just on this one, so you can give me a short answer. Can you ask the producer, that's you, Scott, what he thinks about using artificial intelligence in the music creation process? And are you afraid of this new technology?
All of us are just starting to get dialed into this conversation. I think everybody is a little bit trepidatious about it because we don't know what we're dealing with yet. I think it's fair to say that the prognosis it's scary looking at what can already be done with AI when you know the human tendency to try. All of us are guilty of this. While I complain about my rates not being high enough, I also recognize that I'm guilty. If I'm hiring a guy to detail my car, I want the lowest possible price. We're all doing this. So I want to try to be generous here, but the fact of the matter is if it starts to dawn on people, we all have seen the memes going around about Spotify, the way songwriters are just getting so dishonored financially right now. This is the trajectory of things. It always kind of has been. If it's possible for somebody, if they spend $3 million scoring a big film right now, I don't know if I'm even in the ballpark on that number. But by the time you pay a composer and an orchestra and whatever it costs to do it.
I think that's what David Ships makes.
That's a little inside baseball. Whatever it costs to score something huge. If it becomes apparent that somebody can say, AI, make me 40 minutes of movie score that sounds like Jerry Goldsmith or John Williams, and it can sort of create that for you in a few minutes for whatever the price of a subscription is. I think it is possible that there will be some people who will take advantage of that. I don't think everybody will, but it's hard to see 10 years down the road. But I'm not going to lie, it is disconcerting to say the least, because we know the value that's generally placed on high art. It's not always really high. So we'll see. I mean, I'm a part of me is really optimistic that the human spirit emerges and people value creativity. And it's like in the early '80s when drum machines came out and everybody said drummers will no longer be needed, and it pretty quickly became apparent that no, we do need the human element here. That may still be the case, but technology is such that we're living in an era where we don't even know what to believe when we see something now, because it can look so convincing. So, to what extent that's possible with art remains to be seen. But we'll just have to see how this plays out.
In the future, you might come back on this podcast as a hologram and not even have to show up.
You could just tell AI to listen to this podcast, analyze everything I said.
Yeah.
And start from scratch with new answers. And we're joking, but that's actually very
That's
possible.
how it works. That's crazy. I think that's Jean-Marc.
Hi, Jean-Marc. Yeah. Jean-Marc. When you said it, I was like, I bet that's Jean.
Yeah. Great question. All right, well, before we wrap up here, I had asked you in preparation for this interview, I said, well, since it's a guitar podcast, I would love to know some of your favorite guitar tracks. So why don't we wrap up, and we're going to talk about some of Scott Williamson's favorite guitar tracks.
Well, and when you asked me, I just spit three out that were all three of which completely different area codes.
Okay.
So.
All right, we're going to get to that in a minute.
Okay.
All right, so Scott, this is a guitar podcast, and I wanted to talk to you about, your studio work and music production and engineering, and but I thought, and also let's talk about. I'm curious to know, what are some of your favorite guitar tracks? So you immediately just spit out a handful, just first things that you thought of, and on your list you mentioned "Back in Black" by AC/DC, "Feels So Good" by Chuck Mangione.
Yeah.
Chicken Grease by D'Angelo, and Heaven by BB and CeCe Winans. So let's start at the top of the list. First song that you chose is one I'm actually familiar with. How can you be a guitar player and not know this one? It's Back in Black. So tell me, why did that one come to mind as one of your favorite guitar tracks?
I don't know. It's just, that's so iconic, and it was so perfectly done. Mutt Lange got a hold of AC/DC, and I mean, come on, everybody knows that track, and it's perfect. It's memorable. The tone is amazing.
Yeah.
That's just guitar folklore right there. How do you come up with a list of favorite guitar tracks and not at least give that one? At the very least, it gets honorary mention, but I would say it's
Back in Black.
And I'm a drummer, so let's put this into perspective. I'm not even qualified to be here, but that's one of my favorites. So.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites too. I mean, that whole album, Back in Black, was just monumental, and I believe one of the best-selling albums of all time. It's up there with like Rumors and Thriller and stuff like that. Put up those sorts of numbers.
And you mentioned Rumors. I probably should have said something by Lindsey Buckingham. and didn't, to my own disgrace. But yeah, you're right. It's one of the best-selling records, I think, of all time.
Yeah. Well, AC/DC, they just had this great guitar tone, and they just had such a knack for creating these simple riffs that are not typically what we would talk about if we're talking about virtuosity or anything like that. But yet they've stood the test of time, and they're just irresistible. And we hear these riffs, and they sound so sweet and everything. And actually, I mean, that song has got. I played a little bit of that riff there. Which is fantastic, but then it goes on to the and like the rhythm playing is so good. It's interesting how syncopated that is right there. Nothing's on a predictable beat, but it's just tight and it grooves. The drums are perfect on this song.
Yeah.
This isn't Rush. This isn't Toto. But yet, Phil Rudd, I believe, is the drummer there. I mean, it's like just lays it down perfectly. And the interplay between like the syncopated rhythm guitar part and, the straightforward groove, it's just...
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
You probably know, maybe you didn't, but one of the things for me, regardless of what we're talking about, what we're lauding, the music has to feel great for me to be pulled into it. And this track just has such sex appeal to it. Forgive the term, but my gosh, it just feels great. It's why so many people love Led Zeppelin, is they just brought groove into the rock and roll realm. Bonham just had such a deep pocket. You don't always, especially early rock, you didn't necessarily think of it in terms of pocket. You thought of it in terms of energy, which may or may not be fair, but whatever Bonham brought to it, then got carried forward into some of this other stuff. And I think Back in Black is a great example of sort of building upon some of what Led Zeppelin started. And again, I'm not a music historian, so I may be talking out of turn there, but that's my perception anyway. I just love stuff that feels good, and I think Back in Black is a genius groove track.
Well, you love stuff that feels good.
Oh, whoops-a-daisy. Nice segue. I didn't do that on purpose.
And the next song that you mentioned is Feels So Good by Chuck Mangione.
Yeah, and I know this...
I mean... There are a few things sexier than a flugelhorn.
Yeah, the flugel is... I know...
Did I mispronounce that?
Flugel, yeah.
Oh, there's FL, not flugelhorn.
Oh, you guitar players, you don't know anything about trumpet. See, that was supposed to be funny. I just insulted an entire sector.
You don't have your drum kit here to do the cymbal crash.
Yeah.
Ba-doom, pss.
Well, it's the guitar solo on this song. It was kind of, I think, pivotal for the time. This is 1977, I believe, and Grant Geisman played this solo, and I think it is another one of those musical moments that may have changed trajectory for players in some ways. It's a funny song to bring up for guys who love deep old school jazz, because this is sort of the early days of happy jazz, and some people see this as not a great genre. I'm unapologetically crazy about this track for a bunch of reasons. The drummer is James Bradley Jr. on this track. I used to play, one of the ways I learned to play was by putting on headphones and listening to stuff, and I just thought the drum track on this was so clever. He did some really kind of left-footed things that I just think are so brilliant. And then, I mean, yeah, the way they get into this, even without the guitar solo, this is a great guitar track. But then he gets to the solo, and it comes later, but it's...
Yeah, the volume swells and sliding. Yeah.
And his tone... This has got to be a 335, right? Surely. I don't know what he's...
I'm not hearing it that way. It sounds very thin. I thought that maybe this wasn't tracked with an amp, that maybe it was direct to the soundboard. You had mentioned maybe it was a Roland Jazz chorus.
Yeah.
He's not going through your typical amp circuitry. We don't have the tone and the warmth that you'd have from like AC/DC or something like that. It sounds very direct, but it works for this. We're going to hear something similar in another one of your songs coming up here, the Paul Jackson Jr. part.
Oh, Paul Jackson. Yes,
let's jump to the guitar solo here.
Do it.
By the way, was this a theme, like a TV theme?
No, I don't. Well, it may have been. I mean, I was 6 when this came out, and I still remember hearing it on the radio. But I don't remember if it was used for anything. It was just such a big deal. It was one of the. You'd have to look this up, but I think it's one of the only, jazz-ish tracks ever to make top 40 radio.
Yeah. I mean, I was born in the 70s, so this is very familiar to me, and just it's kind of iconic and everything. I'm listening to the drums here and all these cool hits and everything. I can see why, as a drummer, you would love this. So the guitar takes the head here, but it's really later when he starts to go off.
Right. It's after the sax solo, isn't it? Yeah. There it is.
And it gets quite complicated and flashy.
This.
That's jazz vocabulary.
And this
right
thing
there.
coming up, everybody had to. Here comes it.
Double stops.
Come on, bro.
Yeah, that's high level playing there.
I don't care if you hate happy jazz. This is just objectively good. And then the way they get out of it, I mean, come on, people. You have to at least give that its due. And here's Grant. He wouldn't remember this, and if he listens to this podcast, I don't want to dishonor him by. He played on a band that my dad directed. I was 9 years old. It was clear I was going to be a musician. But my dad and some of his musician buddies thought I had the right armature to play trumpet. They were rehearsing. Grant was there. It was a show band. And I sat down at the drums as a 9-year-old when they were on a break, and I just started playing time. And Grant started playing. Well, I get emotional because I lost my dad a couple of years. Jeez. Edit this out. Sorry. But Grant started playing. And I think the drummer in the band went over to my dad and said, "Hey, Dave, you don't have a trumpet player here. You've got a drummer." And so without having any idea what he was doing, Grant was pivotal in me becoming a drummer, because I'm afraid my dad might have made me play trumpet if that moment hadn't happened. But and Grant probably has no memory of that. So, but yeah, that probably makes this song all the more special to me.
Wow, that's amazing. You were 9?
When that happened, I was 9. Yeah.
And at 9 years old, he realized there's something special about your timing.
Well, I don't know what Grant was thinking. He just was there. Yeah. He just started playing because I was playing, and all I was doing was playing time.
Well,
I wasn't doing anything. The story's more about my dad, but because it was such a formative time of my life, what I remember about it is that Grant started playing guitar with me, and that was huge. So,
well, you talked about how you were just keeping time, playing a simple beat. However, that's the difference between someone that's really got what it takes. You can take different people and have them play the same basic beat, but then some people can make that same basic beat just absolutely come to life. And that's what you're listening for. That's music. Like good musicians aren't necessarily people that play something that's overly complicated.
Yeah.
But they can do the basic stuff and just sound exceptional at it.
Yep.
The next song you mentioned is D'Angelo. Chicken Grease.
Oh,
Let's pull this up.
Here to perform Chicken Grease off his forthcoming album, Voodoo. Please welcome D'Angelo.
This is so nasty. And Questlove. And Pino Palladino, this is a bass clinic. This whole thing, I just can't believe, I still can't believe this.
So this is something you really feel. The groove and the interplay and how the pieces are coming together there.
If someone put a gun to my head and said you have to throw off all music except one thing, this is the genre that I would go, well, it's going to have to be this. I don't know why, but I just...
There's your 335. We're watching the video here on YouTube, D'Angelo Chicken Grease Live.
This is on the Chris Rock show like 20-some years ago. But listen to what he's doing. Everything is so far back. Yeah, but he's not even thinking about it. It's just falling out of these guys. They're not thinking. They're just playing, and it's so far back here, and it just feels... I mean, find me something. Just find me something this good.
Explain what you mean by it's so far back here.
Well, just if this is where the click is... And I don't know if they're listening to a click. I don't know how this is constructed. I just know that wherever the pulse is, the way they're playing it, the whole thing feels a little bit behind it. And so even if they're leaning forward, it doesn't feel like it. Even if they're playing on the front of the click, and I can't see the click, I don't know if they're listening to a click, so we don't know what they were hearing as their foundation. Maybe it was just Questlove. Maybe that's all it is. But they're making it feel like it's back, and that's where the magic is. That's why Led Zeppelin's great. Like where he's singing it so far back that it's almost like back phrasing, and that makes everything. And look at Pino.
I was going to say, doesn't the bass play a major role? Because if everyone's back, then everything's shifted. Then it doesn't sound like it's the placement of the bass with the drums.
I've listened to this so many times trying to analyze. This is why music is. If I start analyzing stuff too hard, listen.
Wait, I need to get a video here.
Pino.
Scott is telling me how much he loves the song Chicken Grease by D'Angelo. This groove, everything is back.
Pino. There's so many elements here. It's like, again, trying to analyze music is sort of a fool's errand, at least for me. The more I think about it, the less it... But this is the kind of thing you want to pick every piece apart and go, this is a stew and every ingredient matters. I mean, Questlove. Those downbeats are...
And how about the harmony there? I mean... That's kind of a tricky switch. So...
Yeah, and he's making it sound like he's not even thinking, or it just seems so easy when,
It's very airy because we have the fourth in there. This is like F minor 7 with a 4 in there. What's this? Same thing, and this is like like a sus2. Got 4s and 2s in there. Little chromatic.
Yeah, and those notes are to me, what all of the notes are, that's where you find the harmonic references. But what's special about this is how they're all feeling it together.
Yeah.
The notes are almost secondary. What the parts are secondary. It's how they're executing the parts that's so special. Just absolutely.
Yeah,
that is a clinic.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's definitely a very cool groove there.
Well, now are we going to get to Paul Jackson Jr.?
Yes, Heaven by BB and CeCe Winans. And do I have this?
It's mostly just the intro to this track, the way that this is a rhythm guitar. Keith Thomas produced this track. This is so early 90s. Okay, we haven't gotten to the guitar yet. There it is. There's Paul. Here we go. Here we go. Listen how... I mean, that pocket... This is all programmed. And Paul's playing live inside of that program, and it sounds programmed. His pocket is so perfect that he sounds like he's part of the program track.
Harmonically, this is very rich. I tried to figure the chords out. I found someone that did a little tutorial. It's piano chords, got a lot of alternate bass notes and stuff. I'm not able to really do it on the guitar. But it's interesting how Paul Jackson Jr., sometimes when you have a song that's just so dense like this, how do you find a place to fit in? But yet he did. Like, I can tell he was intentional where he stayed away from some chords that were too dense, and he found these little spaces to play. Here it is, separated a little bit with that guitar turned up here. I'm using this Moises program.
Yep.
Very unusual progression.
When I first moved to town, there it is. Keith Thomas, I think, is one of the greatest producers.
There it is.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So like, and he's doing like a, he's got a lot of delay there, though. I need to turn this mix up. So, I don't have it dialed in exactly. Sounds like he's playing a Stratocaster, actually.
Oh, surely.
Yeah. So
surely.
I'm on my PRS here. I just split the coils, Then there's like an A flat major 7. And he does some of that,
Oh, dude, yeah.
So Paul Jackson Jr., he played like on the Michael Jackson records, didn't he? He would do that muted stuff like on Billie Jean. Is that Paul Jackson Jr.? Maybe?
I would have to look. It very well may be. Paul, he's a rhythm guitar player's icon. The guy is just unstoppable.
And he was in the American Idol band originally for many of those seasons.
I think that's right. Yeah, he's... Look, there's a reason I picked this stuff out, and boy, I'm realizing now how far across the spectrum I am with these four pieces. But you've got to give these guys their dues.
What impresses me most about this is if I just heard this track without the guitar, I wouldn't really know where to begin. Like, where do I find my place? What do I add? And that's why Paul Jackson Jr. is so good at what he does. You could throw him a super dense piece of music with these keyboard chords that are all over the place and just so rich, and he's going to find a way to add something complementary to it.
And even if, Keith, the guy that produced this, Keith Thomas, I keep saying this, I'm sorry, he's a genius. It is possible that Keith had very specific ideas and fed Paul some of this. Said, here's what I want you to play. Even if that's true, even if not, one of these things was Paul's idea, and I don't know, I wasn't there. But the fact that Paul could play it this tight, like to almost sound like it's part of a keyboard program, bro, that is a skill. That is a skill. That is something every session player, especially back in the days before Beat Detective, this is a skill that people aspired to, and very few of them were this good at it. I mean, Paul's Pocket it's insane how good it is.
When was this recorded? The 80s?
This is, I think it's 90, 89, 90, or 91. I'd have to go back and look. This was I'm almost sure it was their second solo record, and their first one came out about 87. So this is probably 89.
Well, he's got that great Strat single coil tone, and then of course it sounds like he's probably got some chorusing effect and some delay.
Yeah, and listen, just as an aside, if anybody else wants to listen on their own time to the previous BB&CC record, there's a song on that record that Tom Himby did a similar guitar thing on. It's a little slower. It's a song called IOU Me, and he's playing a rhythm part like that throughout the entire song. It's incessant. He said they spent like an entire day work, because it's 2 or 3 parts that they had to do one at a time and just work each bar. Again, this is before Beat Detective. Tom is that's another great guitar track that I probably should have mentioned. So just something else to go look at.
Well, these were great. It was certainly great to these are unique tracks that I probably would not have, ever discussed here on this podcast.
Yay!
And yeah,
I threw something in that was, I'm happy.
Yeah, and it's just interesting knowing you and your level of musicianship and your experience and everything. I was just curious, what gives you goosebumps? And so this is fascinating. So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great discussion.
It has. Thank you.
Man, I might love to have you come back on in the future. Maybe we'll get some more questions. We could talk about some other things. But this has been fantastic. I love it. You're a great conversationalist, great musician, very kind guy, great sense of humor. I want to give you a lot of credit for showing a lot of restraint. Because
oh, gosh, yeah, we could have gone way, way, way off the rails here.
Right. So as we wrap up here, no pressure. What's the one thing we should leave off with? What's the one piece of advice you want to give musicians before we?
Usually when I give advice, I give it based on my own character flaws and my own experience with my character flaws. Do your level best to be humble, which will make people want to be with you, and as we keep saying, develop a very wide musical vocabulary, because that will spawn your creativity.
A wide musical vocabulary.
Wide. As wide as possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Your mom's as wide as possible.
Yeah, we finally got there. It finally happened. I'll make sure my mother hears this podcast, and I'll tell her to listen to the very end of it.
All right. One more thing I want to mention before we go is that everyone can go to YouTube. They can search for Pilot Eats Food,
yes.
Because when he's not behind the drum kit or in the studio, You're flying an airplane and you're making a bunch of off-color jokes.
Well, not terribly off color. I'm a devout Christian, so I'm trying to be well behaved. But yeah, it's sort of my version of a podcast. Flying, I mentioned that it's the only other thing I know how to do, and so I take friends out and we go find greasy spoon restaurants in small towns and talk about music or not music.
That's Scott Williamson, Pilot Eats Food.
Thanks for the plug.
And,
that's nice of you.
Yeah, and we might need to go eat some food right now. All right, podcast episode 164 is a wrap. If you have additional questions for Scott, send them to me, and I'll have him back on for another episode in the future. Don't forget to sign up for a free video course at my website, guitarmusictheory.com. Whether you're a beginner still needing to learn the basics, or you need help with bar chords, finger picking, guitar soloing, or understanding music theory, I have a free video course for you I'll provide you with a plan to put you on track to fill gaps in your playing so you can move forward and reach your music goals. Enroll in your free video course now at guitarmusictheory.com. You can click on the link in the podcast show notes. All right, guitar engineers, thanks for listening. I'm Desi Cerna. Before you go, be sure to subscribe to this podcast, give it a 5-star rating, and leave a review if you can. Then, keep playing and stay tuned for more.